Hi guys, my name is David Dispinat with Media Unlocked, and today we're going to be working on part 2 of our walkthrough of the Canon 60 Mark II. In part 1, of course, we went over all the buttons and functions on the outside of the camera and just kind of broke down the whole outside of the camera. Today we're going to go into the M mode on the dial, and we're going to go over all the menu functions over the next few videos. So let's get started. We'll go on and hit menu, and the very first thing that pops up under our red camera menu up here is our image quality. So what we can do is we can go down here, hit set, go into it. Now, if you do this wheel right here, this is going to pick our JPEG settings, because we do have the option to shoot JPEG and RAW at the same time. I usually prefer to shoot just RAW, but you do have the option if you need both. So if you notice, you have large JPEG, and medium JPEG, and then small JPEG. And then different variations of those depending on as far as the size and how many megapixels are going to be. If you leave it on here, then it's not going to shoot JPEG at all. If you use the shutter wheel up here at the top, we can again go through RAW, medium, full size RAW, medium size RAW, and small size RAW. Or if we just wanted to shoot JPEG, we could click this and then just pick the large JPEG. Or if we have both of them selected, now we're going to shoot RAW and JPEG. So every time you take a picture, it will make one RAW file, one JPEG file. I'm just going to leave it as I had it before. Now we'll hit menu to go back, and we'll move down to image review. So the image review is set to 2 seconds. And mainly what that means is after you take an image, it's going to pop up on the back of your screen so that you may chimp, as we all call it, and take a look to make sure that picture was good or bad, or you needed to make corrections. If 2 seconds isn't enough, let's change it to 4 seconds. Or we can go to 8 seconds. 2 seconds usually does it for me. Next is going to be our release shutter without card. So mainly you can release the shutter without the card. This is enabled. If you disable this, then you will not be able to release the shutter without a card in the camera. We'll hit menu to go back again. And we'll go to lens aberration correction. So what that is, and we can go on and just click in here, and you can actually turn on or off certain settings in here, like diffraction, distortion correction, chromatic aberration on, and then peripheral illumination. The biggest thing is, what that means is, I don't know if you've ever taken a photo, but you've noticed on the edges of certain parts of the photo, like you take a picture of a barn, and on the edges of the barn, you're going to get these like weird looking greens and purples, and maybe a little bit of pinks in there. And the nice thing is, in today's software like Lightroom, you can just click a button and most of that is gone and it will be fixed. But the idea is that maybe we try to fix this in camera if possible. What actually causes it is when you have mainly 2 pixels hitting each other that have a very difference in contrast, and you get these weird colors. And a lot of that happens on lines, like I said, a barn, the line of a barn hitting the actual sky, and you get that difference in contrast, and then you get these weird colors. Now again, these days between cameras and software, it's not as big of an issue as it was 2-3 years ago when I was shooting. And with the larger frame sensors, it does help, where if you're using some of the cheaper Rebel series cameras, let's say for Canon, it still can pop up, and it definitely popped up quite a bit back when you had a T2i or T3i. All right, we'll just hit the shutter button to wake this bad boy back up. And we'll go back into the menu system and move on to the lens electronic manual focus. So I have this disabled after one shot or enabled after one shot. I have chosen to pick disabled. We'll hit menu and we'll go to the external speed light control. Now, since I don't have a speed light connected, we're not going to go through this because I could actually make a video just about the external speed light control, because there's a lot of different things that can be done with the external speed light. But mainly what this allows you to do is go in and completely control your speed light. So if you have a speed light connected to your camera, you can go in here and you can control all of your functions. Of course, we have it enabled, but if you don't want your speed light to be enabled, you could connect a speed light to it, have this disenabled, and you're going to have some issues getting that speed light to work. So we want to, of course, have that enabled. And then we have your ETTL2 meter, and you could have it at evaluative or average. The evaluative is center weighted, and where the average is going to take the information as a whole. ETL, again, is pretty much an automatic flash. So the idea is that the flash is going to meter and try to figure out how much light you need for the shot you're taking, without you actually having to specifically tell the flash, I want this much power and I want it to be this wide. We have our flash sync, and then the flash function settings. Again, these we cannot go into because we don't have a flash connected. We'll hit menu. Moving on to the next option, number 2 up here with the red camera. And we will hit the exposure compensation. We'll go in there. We can pick anything from -5 all the way to +5, or -1 to +1. Now this is great for high dynamic range photos. So what we're going to do is we've set it at 3 right now. Now we can fix that, and we could do up to 7 different ones if we wanted to. And I will show you how to do that later on in probably part 3 of this video series. And we'll go on and we'll click in there. And what this does is, again, a high dynamic range photo is when we take an underexposed photo, a properly exposed photo, and an overexposed photo, and we combine them into one photo, therefore trying to help with the overexposure and underexposure parts and the shadows. So I'm going to take, and what it will do is I'm going to do 3 shots. Shot 1, shot 2, shot 3. So we hit play right here, it's the little play button. And if you notice, this is our overexposed, our underexposed, and our properly exposed photo. Now granted, I did not preset the settings to where they needed to be, so these are way off, but then you would combine those 3 items in post and get a pretty nice photo, ideally. Some people go way overboard and really push the dynamic range and make the photos look really fake or like a painting. So again, and it will keep taking 3 different photos every time until I go back in, again, those 3 different photos, and it will change the exposure each time until I go back in here, and I use the shutter wheel up here, and now we're just back to single shots. ISO speed settings. Right now, my ISO is set to 800, as you guys can see. And ISO speed range, I've got it set to a low of 50, which is not native, it is digital, so it does the ISO of 50 in camera, and it works fairly well. But if you want something that's native, again, just go back up to 100. So, but I've got it set to our minimum at the low at 50, and the maximum at a little over 100,000, which is our high 2. Again, we can go in here and we can change that. And we could go down to our max could be 1600, and we don't want to go over that. The 100,000 is going to be super grainy and not usable, but it is great for like when I go and shoot stars, and I have a manual 14mm f2.8, and I want to really focus on those on a specific star or a cluster of stars. I can use that to get a bunch of light, even though it's really grainy, and make sure that and zoom in and get a really good shot of the focusing on those stars. And then I'll go back to like an ISO of like 1600 to 3200, depending on what I need and how bright it is that night. So again, we can always use the touchscreen if we want. Our auto range is 100 to 12,800. We could change that again. So again, that's your automatic range. So if you're telling your camera that if we're using automatic instead of manual on our dial, it will be between 100 and 12,800. It won't go below 100. It won't go over 12,800. That can be changed as well. Again, I always keep it manual, and because I like to have more control instead of less control. We'll go back. We'll go to Auto Light Optimizer, and I usually keep this off. But mainly what this does is it's going to help in your shadows, and the camera is going to digitally use its software inside to help try to fix your photo so that the lighting is a little bit better, you have a better dynamic range and more stops. Again, the camera is doing this inside of it, and I trust my editing software like Lightroom and Photoshop way better, so I tend to just leave this off and not let the camera do any extra work, because I want my file to be as raw as possible without any edits on it. White balance, again, you have AWB, which is auto white balance. Then you have daylight, shade, cloudy, tungsten lighting, white fluorescent, flash, a custom one if you need it, and your own personal Kelvin temperature. Again, you can just use your shutter wheel up at the top, or just the wheel at the top. And then you can hit set, and it will set it to a custom Kelvin temperature. I usually just leave it in auto white balance, but I do use that custom Kelvin temperature, especially when I'm shooting astrophotography. Again, I love shooting the stars. Also, if you're using flash or constant lighting, the custom Kelvin temperature can work very well for you as well. We can also set up a custom white balance. The idea is you would take an 18% gray card, you would take a picture of it in the lighting setting that you're going to be constantly using, something like in the studio. If you're going to be outdoors and the sun and clouds are going to be constantly changing, that custom white balance is not going to work. So you, again, take that picture of the 18% gray card, you've got a model, you're going to be using the same light. This is going to help with getting your flash set up, your strobes, and you'll hit set, and that will be your custom white balance, which is really nice. You have your white balance shift bracket. Again, if you don't know what you're doing in here, do not mess with this. But mainly if you want some very specific colors or tones and you know what that is, you can go into your bracket and you can mess with it and you can kind of float around and do all kinds of weird things. I do not mess with this because it's not something that I really use. I'm sure people that have very specific artistic ideas and things, colors they want to use, they may go in here and mess around with that. Color space. All right, so you have sRGB and Adobe RGB are your two options, and then there is Pro Photo, which is really what you want to be exporting when you're in Lightroom or Photoshop. But this is going to really help for print work. The idea is that sRGB has a pretty large spectrum of different colors, where Adobe RGB has a larger spectrum, and of course you have Pro Photo, which has the largest spectrum of colors. Therefore, Adobe RGB being your best option because it is out of the sRGB, it's going to have a larger spectrum of colors. Therefore, when you edit, you have more colors. When you're printing, the idea is that the colors come out nicer, and you just have a way bigger color spectrum. Moving on to the third setting in the Red cameras is the picture styles. Now, picture style really only has any effect on your images if you're shooting JPEG. If you're shooting RAW, then it's not going to burn into your photo. Where JPEG, JPEG again is a complete file format. And so if you pick one of these picture styles, depending on what you want, landscape, portrait, fine. I tend to fall towards neutral because it makes the colors flat, and then I can put the color information back in myself and figure out how I want to use that. Again, if you're shooting RAW, it doesn't really matter. It's going to come in neutral anyways, and you're going to have that more control when editing your photos in Photoshop or Lightroom. Long exposure noise reduction. Again, I keep it off. This is another one of those things where the camera tries to add in a reduction on noise and exposure, and it does it inside the camera, therefore not baking in information into the image that I don't want them to, that I can fix with third-party software or Adobe or Lightroom, and I'm Adobe, Photoshop, or Lightroom, and I'm able to fix that myself. So again, this is another one of those things, I leave it off. High ISO speed, another one of those options. Again, I leave it off. So this is again going to try to add information into your photo to help with the ISO and fix it. And as you notice, it says options are limited with RAW or RAW plus JPEG image quality. Just go on and leave it off unless this is something you think you really need and you want the camera to help you out. I do not want the camera to help me out. I can help myself out while I'm editing the photos. Highlight tone priority. You can enable that or not. Again, that has to do with your highlights and how your tones come out in your highlights. Again, the camera is doing work for you. I prefer to do that work myself, so I leave that off. Dust elite data. What that means is you shoot a white card to figure out exactly where the dust is on your sensor, and your camera tries to go in and clean off those specific dust specks when doing a sensor cleaning. Moving on, multiple exposure shot. So if you want to do a multiple exposure shot, we can go in and set that up. We can enable it. I prefer to do average over additive, which is going to take information from the whole scene. And then number of exposures. Again, I've got it set to 7, and continuous one shot. Now, let me just go out of this real quick and just show you. So when I take a picture, it's going to see 6, and it's going to let you know as you take each one right there. So what we're going to go back in and we're going to disable it. And then we're going to go back out to menu and then HDR mode. You can't do HDR mode in manual. What you'll have to do is you'll have to switch over to one of your custom functions. And then we'll be able to go into HDR mode and we can go in and we can make the EV1, 2, or 3. I usually do a larger separation so that I have more information from the over and under exposures. Again, you can do neutral, art standard, art vivid, art bold. I'm going to go on and hit neutral because I want to put the colors back in when I edit it. And we can set continuous one shot and then auto image align. Of course, we want to have that enabled because if there's any kind of movement in the camera, even though you're on a tripod, you should not be doing this handheld. Then there could be, if you take 3 or 4 or 5 different shots, you could get them off alignment and they aren't exactly all the same shot. And so the camera's going to try to go in there and align that. So that's one of the times I'm going to let the camera do some work for me. Again, we'll go back to the M mode on the dial. So you have to be on one of the custom functions, C1 or C2, if you're going to do the HDR. All right, going into our final one, number 4, interval timer. So we can enable that, and this is how we're going to set up something for time lapse. We can do how many ever number of shots we want to do at how many seconds. So let's say I want to do 10 shots at 10 seconds. So every 10 seconds, the camera will take a picture, then we'll take all those files and we'll edit a time lapse together. And I like to use a program called LR time lapse. It's amazing, it works well with Lightroom. You edit an LR time lapse, or you bring the files into LR time lapse, send it into Lightroom, edit the coloring, send it back into LR time lapse. It does the information and it makes time lapses look just beautiful. Again, we'll go back. Actually, I'm going to go on and disable that. We did not have that in the original 60, so it's really nice to be able to do those time lapses here in the 60 Mark II. Moving on, bulb timer. Of course, bulb timer we're not going to be able to use unless we're in the B mode. So we'll go to the B mode on the dial. We'll hit menu, bulb timer. The really cool thing is that we can enable it, and then we can set our bulb timer by hitting the info button. And we want to set it to, let's say, 37 seconds. We can hit OK. And now it will open our shutter up for 37 seconds and then grab the shot so we don't have to sit here and hold the shutter button and hoping that we get no shake that way, or using an external remote, which is very nice. So I'm going to go on and disable that, and we're going to go back to the M mode, and we're going to hit menu, and now we're going to do anti-flicker. So this is going to help with anti-flicker when shooting. Again, it can't hurt to go on and enable that. I leave that enabled. Mirror lockup, if you want to be able to lock that up. Again, I think you have to be in one of the custom functions to do the mirror lockup. Aspect ratio, 3:2, 4:3, 6:9, 1:1. It just sets 3:2. It doesn't really matter to me because, again, when you're shooting raw and you bring it into Lightroom, you can kind of pick what you want your aspect ratio to be. Live view shoot, again, live view mode is this. So you're able to shoot with live view mode, and that's enabled. We hit that, we can turn it back off, go into menu, and of course we got that enabled. Now, the last few things that we're going to go over is protect images. We can go in and do a bunch of information for protecting images and locking them. A lot of these blue functions, I don't know how many of you out there actually use them. I do not use them at all. I don't know if I've ever used one of the blue functions once, minus the HDMI option, which we'll go over in a minute. You can rotate your images here, you can erase images, you can set up a print order, exactly how it sounds. Photo book setup, again, this is not something I would use as I would do this on my computer, but if you do not have a computer, then you do have the option to go in here and set up a photo book setup. As you can see, but of course I don't have any compatible images, they probably have to be in JPEG. Raw image processing, moving on. If we need to crop, resize, we need to rate, slideshow, this all just as it says it. You can crop your image, you can resize your image, you can rate your image, which the rating system at one point in time did have some value, but the rating system in Lightroom works so much better that I just don't even use that. Back in the day when I was using Adobe Bridge, I liked the rating system in the camera and it actually go in and rate my photo. So I did use the blue system for that as well, or the blue dial system. Set image search conditions. So you can set different image search conditions and image jump, which if you can set up how many images you want to jump depending on when you're viewing them with the dial up here on the shutter, with the shutter dial. Moving on to the third item, you have what's called a highlight alert. So this is going to let you, it's going to probably put a black patch around pretty much the same thing as zebras for people to shoot video. And it's going to let you know when you're overexposed, and then you need to make the decision, is that a big deal or not? Autofocus point disabled. We have playback grid. If you need a grid, you have the option to set up a grid. I do not use a grid. Histogram display. I use it to brightness instead of RGB, and of course histograms are very important in figuring out your whites and darks and how overexposed or underexposed and your midtones work. So if you don't know how to use a histogram, go on Google or YouTube and search, because a histogram is very important for a photographer. Magnification, and we have different options for magnification here. And then control over HDMI, and that is nice too. So you can go and enable that so you can have control over the HDMI when you're going out to a TV. And that is the conclusion for part 2 of the video. Well, if you guys have made it this far, one thing I should mention is there is a little card button. If you scroll back a little bit, you can hit the little card button and it will pop out and will show all 4 videos. So if you wanted to watch 1, 2, 3, or 4, depending on which video you're on, then you can go watch that video. Thanks for stopping in and making it this far though. Over here to the right will be our newest video, which might be one of these videos themselves at the time. Down here diagonally, we are going to put a link to the 6D Mark II that will send you over to B&H. If you are interested in purchasing it, it does give us a little commission. And as always, guys, come on, you made it this far. This has been quite helpful. Go on and hit that subscribe button. It helps us out. And as always, guys, we'll catch you next time.